You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. I'm here to talk to you about the Avengers Initiative. And to help me in assembling the Avengers is John Mills.
Indeed I am. Bigger, badder, and tying loose ends together like never before.
You know, and we actually are going to have some Avengers. We are finally going to assemble the Avengers tonight.
That's right.
Some assembly required, I guess, but yeah.
Yes, very much so. And, I have a lot of thoughts coming into this one. This is my first time hitting Disney's Marvel's The Avengers in a while. And so it's a very different type of experience watching it now with all everything behind us and just knowing how it's going to play out, and just so different watching it.
Okay, before we get to all that, I want to just say a huge thank you to everybody that's listening. I appreciate the response to Assembling Avengers. We've had lots of people downloading the show. We'd love to hear from you, so catch up with us on Twitter at the 602 Club. Use the hashtag Assembling Avengers. Again, John and I would just love to hear your thoughts about the show if you're listening. You can also find us on Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. Of course, we've got the listeners-only discussion group there called the Babel Conference. You can join and talk to us there about what you're thinking about the show. Loving the discussion there, so thank you for everyone who's listening and commenting there. Of course, you can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's been doing that. We had a new review come out on Apple Podcasts for the 602 Club feed, so thank you so much. If you do like us, hit us up with a star rating review on Apple Podcasts. That does still help the show grow because, still in the main place people are getting their podcasts. It's crazy. And then you can also find us over on Trek.fm, which is our website where you can find everything that we're doing, as well as send us an email over at Trek.fm/contact. So, John, I did want to actually, and we've been doing this in some of our more recent episodes where kind of like before we even start about like our first times to see that there's some interesting behind the scenes stuff. And this movie was originally penned by the same person, Zach Penn, who had done The Incredible Hulk. He had written that movie. And one of the questions that you asked me last movie when we talked about Captain America, the first Avenger, was about villains. And I was reading that they had always intended to use Loki as the villain, but Penn had also had early discussions about using Red Skull. And I thought that was fascinating that had actually been in contention at all.
It would have made sense. I mean, we saw how Red Skull went. It was technically set up the way that they would have had to break one of their rules about how the Infinity Stones worked and stuff like that as we understood them. But that wasn't established by this point. So it was wide open. I think Loki is the better choice, but Red Skull would have been really interesting. Like, Red Skull was a very specifically Captain America enemy. Loki, even though he's Thor's brother, he's a god. So he has a much larger global sense of threat than somebody who's hyper-localized to being part of the secret Nazi organization versus Cap. But an interesting discussion to be had, nonetheless.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you on that. I think that makes more sense. And, what's really interesting, too, is that Marvel snatches up Joss Whedon to have him rewrite the script. He honestly writes a lot of this. There's a whole bunch of behind-the-scenes info about how he's really frustrated that he didn't get sole writing credit on the movie. But Marvel stipulates that he include the Avengers against Loki as the battle in the middle. So I thought that this was interesting because we kind of talked about the idea as well of Marvel kind of starting to put their thought process into, okay, this movie has to include this. So this is one of those places where we actually do see that Marvel's saying, hey, no, this has to be in the movie.
Which is why it makes sense, honestly, to bring Whedon on. Because Whedon is, first and foremost, a TV director. And TV directors there are great TV directors out there. There are people who are, that medium they were made for it, and the medium was made for them. But they operate best, honestly, in an environment where there's somebody putting, like a fence around them. You have to stay and play in this sandbox. And I think that's why Whedon becomes a logical fit for the Marvel franchise. And probably the fact that he does become that logical fit probably informs their directing decisions later on down the road.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you that he made a good choice, obviously, with the way that fans, the small group of fans have responded, to his show Firefly, and of course what they did with Serenity, it made sense, that they would be interested in having him here to direct the Avengers. Obviously, they were liking the ideas he was coming up with when it came to rewriting the script here. And it also makes sense, this idea of, he'd already worked with an ensemble cast, and so trying to bring an ensemble together here in the sense of all of the Avengers coming together, that also makes sense. And so I think, aside from, and I think we'll talk about later, obviously, any issues we have with Whedon, and especially with what's come out recently about his behavior on certain sets and all. But we see here, I think that, he does have the chops to be able to try and mesh together a bunch of different characters, give them all their own moments, but at the same time have the work feel more cohesive.
Yeah, there's no lie that Whedon is very adept at taking ensemble casts and putting them together. That's not a big major revelation. It's right in his wheelhouse. It's exactly where he lives and has always lived. That's always been his focus. So again, that sort of TV background lends itself to something a little bit different, because this is not Captain America. Captain America's story can be about Captain America. Iron Man's story can be about Iron Man, Thor, the Incredible Hulk. It can be all about those guys. We still, I think you and I, we already talked about this, but Black Widow should have been in that build-up with her own thing. But whatever. What are you going to do? I think that what is really interesting, and I think the reason that Whedon's TV chops help him out and help the movie out as a whole here, is the fact that he's used to working in the recap, so that if you missed a previous episode, you can still catch what's going on. In terms of filmmaking, I think it's both a good and a bad, and I want to get your take on this, because for me, it's both a good and a bad. Because in one sense, it turns this into a big budget television show. And we'll talk about the other ways that it reflects that, later on in the conversation. Because you get the recap. This is who this character is. This is where we're coming to. But there's this big implication of it's got a different feel than, say, let's just take Return of the Jedi. Return of the Jedi doesn't make any verbal reference to, hey, you remember that time on Cloud City? Hey, we fought on Hoth that one. Doesn't make reference to those sorts of things. This script does. This script makes reference to past episodes I didn't see. So there just seems to be just a more blunt, a less subtle way of bringing everybody together. Do you get that same thing, or am I being nitpicky on this?
No, I don't think you're being nitpicky, because, and I think you made an excellent reference to Return of the Jedi, and, the struggle that Marvel has here with, you have a loose set of sequels to movies that are introducing all of these different characters, but are all loosely tied into a story that's continuing forward. And Avengers is the end game of that. Pun intended.
Fair enough.
And so, but you're also trying to make sure that, well, what if somebody missed, Captain America? What if somebody missed Thor? We want to make sure that you have just enough so that you kind of understand where these characters are coming from, which, is interesting, because you mentioned the idea of bringing Whedon in because he is a television director. And in many ways, I think this is our first implication that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is going to become television for film, where you have to have seen the previous installments to truly get the most out of the next film. And that the work that the films are doing is not just to service the story there, but also to set up continuous stories, just as a TV show is doing.
I'll actually pile on there and say that one of the things, and I'm not trying to show too much leg here because we have the rest of the show to go through, but one of the things that I think is really frustrating about this movie is because we're purposely coming at it with a more critical eye this time, just trying to pick it apart a little bit more. The first time I saw this, and we skipped our usual "did you see this in the theater" thing. We both saw it in the theater, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, and we'll get to some of that stuff later, for sure.
But what is, tremendously frustrating in one regard is watching it this time with that more critical eye and saying to myself, what is this movie about? What is it really about? And all I can say is it's really about nothing. It's about bringing the characters together. I understand that there's sort of a surface thing about Tony is, he's self-sacrificial at the end. He goes on the same arc that he's been on twice before. Okay, we'll go through it again with him. Cap is, everybody else is sort of steady state through the movie. There's no real focus on growth or tremendous depth. It's all very surface level. And I think that's because Whedon, while we're sitting here praising, okay, he has this great television pedigree, he has television pedigree from the 90s mostly.
Right. It's
not the type of television pedigree that we would be referring to now with Netflix and streaming series and giant mythological arcs. But that thing is what I'm mostly at is, what is this really about besides making a movie to happen?
Well, yeah, and I'll challenge that because I do think that the movie is about something. Unfortunately, I don't think it's able to completely follow through. And I think there's two things. One, it's about what we lost. Cap talks about, as he comes back, this idea of, they say we won the war and that we defeated them, but what have we lost? And interestingly enough, as we move forward, Captain America becomes the character to which all of this revolves around morally, which is he's going to continually be asking the question about what we have lost. And we get the whole thing about, Agent Coulson telling him that people might just need a little bit of old-fashioned. And I think what one of the things that this movie is saying specifically is that we have lost the kind of like good versus evil, all of those kind of conversations, trying to be quote-unquote more nuanced. And what we need is a little bit of old-fashioned. And to me, that's always been one of the main themes for this film, which is that, and again, it all circles around the character of Captain America challenging the modern sensibilities of, is the modern way of thinking about things the right way to be thinking about things, or do we actually need a little bit of old-fashioned? Do we need to stop approaching things always as if everything has, 32,000 different points of nuance? And so I think that's part of the question. And that ties into the whole idea of classical liberalism versus tyranny, which obviously Cap represents and the Avengers represent, versus what the big speech that Loki gives about, you're just made to kneel and all of those kind of things. So
I think you're being generous there, specifically because the way this is structured is there are threads that, say, the Winter Soldier will much more explore.
Absolutely.
Cap has lines like, this isn't freedom, this is fear. And it's a very much, post 9/11 sort of thing.
Yes.
So you can be generous and you can say Whedon is teeing it up. But that in and of itself speaks to what I think is that core flaw of it doesn't, in your words, follow through. It has no intention of following through. There's no this shadow council that's quote unquote really running the world is never presented as a net negative until we get to the Winter Soldier.
Well, and that's one of the questions then, and obviously this is something that The Dark Knight does way better, which we do also deal with the whole idea of escalation in this film. You know, the whole thing about, you know, you bring in automatic weapon or semi-automatic weapons, and then they bring in automatic weapons, you know, that whole thing that we talk about in The Dark Knight, and this whole idea of escalation, and that because somebody like, you know, Thor has arrived on our world, the Earth has been put on a pedestal now with the greater galactic universe, and we are unprepared for the escalation now that we are a part of, which is why one of the reasons, you know, Fury says that we need the Avengers as well as the weapons that he was creating that they end up finding. So I think that the movie, that it's trying to say some very interesting things. I do think that the problem is that the movie is overstuffed with a lot of things that take away from the ability to really digest these thematic plot points, and not even plot points, but these thematic ideas, because it gets lost in, especially at the end of the movie, isn't this cool? Just look at a bunch of stuff blowing up and people doing cool things, and it really loses any cohesion at that point of thematic ability, and I think that's really the thing that gets frustrating. And I do think that part of that comes from its inability to, and this is completely a Whedon problem, to actually stay serious for more than 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, that's a huge liability here. But I think that so and I'm gonna just, after I make this next comment, I'm gonna hit the accelerator. We're gonna get right to the elephant in the room as far as the two of us are concerned with regards to the Marvel movies. But I think that, first and foremost, the problem with these themes that arguably are, you know, hinted at is you just put your finger right on it. It's wrapped up so neatly. It's not a pondering about, wow, Fury was developing these secret weapons and we can't trust anybody, and there's a shadow cabal running the world that's not healthy, that's not good. Who do they answer to? And instead but in the end, the Avengers won, so it was all worthwhile. And while I understand that gives you the room to follow it up in The Winter Soldier, it's not satisfying within the context of its own self-contained story.
Yes.
Which gets back to the thing we keep hitting on, which is this is a TV episode. It's a big crossover TV event, or a big crossover comic book. This is just like comic books, where you have the separate titles and then you come together for one big crossover, like Onslaught, or the Dark Phoenix saga, or not Dark Phoenix, but anyway, where Mr. Sinister came in and stuff like that. I'm getting older, so I can't really remember all this stuff off the top of my head. But anyway, let's just go to the elephant in the room, because I'm dying to talk about it. You know, we went on the journey in Snyder Cuts, which is available in this feed. Mm-hmm. The Battle of New York here is very much held as a contrast to how the Battle of Metropolis goes in Man of Steel. And I, too, fell in the trap. Well, look, at least they're going around saving people. At least you have the beauty shot that's very Michael Bay-esque, of the pretty blonde running into a bagel store and turning around and looking concerned as the battle is reflected in the window in front of her. It's a very Michael Bay moment. But Michael Bay does it better, arguably, as long as you're not talking about Transformers movies, which suck. But when you're going along there is wanton destruction going on in New York City. And it is ridiculous. And while you can sit there and you can say, well, Cap starts giving orders to clear the streets and stuff like that, even that is, well, they have a team. And so Cap is a natural leader, so of course he can start giving orders and other people can fan out. But New York takes a beating. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of stuff falling. There's a giant space worm that falls over and literally decimates 2 buildings at the end of it. But because they didn't approach it the way that Snyder does, which is showing people not just getting into the coffee shop, but getting trapped under the concrete and rebar and everything like that, there's this different perception. And I just want to get your take on it. Coming back to Avengers after all of this time, with all of that we've gone back and forth about on Snyder Cuts and my changing perceptions about the Battle of Metropolis and everything like that, what do you walk away with here? Is it just something where they're like, he plugs his ears and puts his head in the sand and we'll just ignore that there must have been thousands of people killed because it's bright and candy colored and that's okay?
It was really interesting rewatching the film because I was watching how many punches that they're pulling. I mean, the reality is that this team, even though there are still 5 of them, these things are flooding all over New York, causing destruction, right?
Yes.
So regardless of anything that they're doing, there are still hundreds, if not more, of these things wreaking havoc all over the city. I mean, we also see those big worm things continue running in the buildings, and the buildings are barely affected. That's not reality. If you cut out the whole side of a building or the corner of a building, most likely you're going to have floors begin falling. You know, like there's so little reality to what's actually going on, and this battle goes on forever.
Yep.
Without any good reason for it to be going on forever. Like, all of it just becomes about, hey, look how cool it is to watch everybody helping. And honestly, my wife and I both looked at each other at the end of the movie and we're like, that just went on the end of this movie way too long, because the ultimate goal here is to stop these things from coming, because yes, there are 5 of them, but there's still not enough of them to keep absolute destruction of New York from happening. And we're taking so long watching them save people. But what about for every one they're saving, probably 30 to 100 are dying. So, and the problem is the movie doesn't deal with that reality. And so it makes it seem like they save all these people when in all reality, like thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people in New York died this day. And if they had been honest, lots more buildings would have, it would have looked like 9/11 on steroids with the amount of buildings that probably would have fallen. And, they just don't want to go there. So they sanitize everything. It's the Disney effect, honestly.
Yes. And that's right. And it's also, to an extent, a disservice, because people will say, well, it's a comic book movie. And it's like, even like Snyder is truer to the comic books at this moment in time.
He is.
Because the comic books don't shy away from the normal everyday people who are getting affected by all of these things.
The death of Superman is a perfect example.
Right.
The rampage of Doomsday throughout all the way to Metropolis. I mean, the whole point of that was the amount of destruction this creature is creating from the moment he lands all the way to his way into Metropolis, and then the way that fight affects Metropolis. Like, that's exactly where Snyder is taking reference from.
Right. And the thing is, I'm not sitting here and beating up on the end battle here. I'm just saying it's so fascinating how brightening the picture and not showing people truly afraid, showing them movie afraid, safe and sound inside the shop, looking out the windows and everything, is a very slick and cynical move in terms of the filmmaking, because of that exact fact that we know it should be going differently than it is. And, for that reason, it's like, I think that's why, the comparisons are really not, the contrasts are really not fair, because Snyder goes to greater effort to put his Superman in our world instead of the cartoon world. So this is cartoon world.
Right.
And it's just, it was just jarring, because I was sitting there thinking, when the S falls off of the Stark Tower and falls on the building below, just because it doesn't show the people in the building below, I'm like, well, that definitely killed some people right there. And it's just odd how that perception changes. But I do agree with you that final battle it starts to drag after a little bit. It's like, okay,
you could cut
I got
10 minutes out of it and be fine. Like, legitimately 10 minutes.
I don't know if I'd say 10. Definitely 5. Definitely 5.
I mean, which in film time is an incredible amount of time.
Oh yeah, no, that's
So-
people don't realize how different time distorts in film because of the cuts and the moves and everything like that. But like 5 minutes of film time.
Mm-hmm.
There was some movie, Sirens, I think in the 90s. I never saw it, but it was famous because it was like Hugh Grant and they had these supermodels in it who appeared.
I remember.
in the buff.
I've never seen it either. I just remember just because of all the supermodels that were in it.
But I remember the specific article talking about the fact that it only had a grand total of 70 seconds of nudity in it. 70 seconds, 1 minute and 10 seconds in the entire movie. And it was skirting like the NC-17 line as a result. So when we talk about cut 5 minutes or cut 10 minutes, that's a lot more than you think at first blush. Mm-hmm. Like it's kind of crazy. Yeah. Just the time dilation that happens.
Yeah, it's, it is interesting because I remember coming into this movie and obviously at this point being very excited and seeing it in the theater. And, at this point, I think, in many ways it was kind of a pinnacle of filmmaking, mainly because you just never thought that this could possibly happen, to have this many heroes in a film at one time. So you can't take that away from this movie. And I think that's something that's really important. And I also think, and something I wanted to get your opinion on was this, is that obviously we've already talked about this entire cast because we've already talked about all of these people together, and for the most part. I think really the only main character that's kind of new here, because this is her first introduction, is Colby Smulders as what's-her-face. I just heard...
Agent something or other?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I just can't remember at this exact moment. But which shows you how important she is. I love her character. I think it's fun. She's great. I always loved her because she was in How I Met Your Mother. Anyway, but so bringing this cast together, part of this is that, we have to do the classic thing where they fight. And I feel like that the first fight makes a little bit more sense because none of these people trust each other at all. And they have no reason to, really. And of course, Tony's being Tony, which we'll talk about probably later on in the series, that he's maybe Marvel's greatest villain. But I felt like rewatching the film, when they get to the second where everybody's at each other's throats, I understand that it's the amplification of the scepter that's ramping up all these feelings in these characters. But it just feels a little bit forced to me. Am I the only one who's feeling like that, or did you feel like that at all as well?
I think that it didn't have to feel forced. I think that it winds up feeling forced because Whedon is following TV logic, which is a lot more forgiving in terms of bouncing around from conversation to conversation. When it's a movie, it's just it doesn't flow as well the way that it's cut together. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not helped by the fact that, again, I think a lot of these things are very surface level. I'm going to say a line that means this, you're going to say a line that means that, and not taking the time to actually dissect it. And in a giant, quote-unquote, fight, argument like that with everybody, it really would coalesce into essentially two sides as opposed to however many different side conversations happening. It would really coalesce into, yeah, Cap's right. What are you talking about? And yeah, no, Tony's right. And, the people splitting along that way and probably somebody being a peacemaker sort of thing. That's easier to follow. And it's a lot less of jamming bullet points into your head. I also think that the fight itself winds up being, no lie, completely pointless. Because it all gets derailed anyway, and they wind up working together when Hawkeye goes bad and blows the engine.
Right.
You didn't really need to have that argument. You could have an entire thing where maybe there's some tension in the room, and you wonder if it's going to turn into a fight. Hawkeye does his thing, and they all work together, but they don't work together well. and they're not quite getting why they're not working together well. And so it just makes it leaner and more direct and straightforward. And you could have even put some of that argument dialogue happening during the fight. That would have layered it because everybody's in different spaces. They can have separate conversations, and it's not this big mashed potato mess of words flying around the room.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, part of it too is that, even that first fight is just a big measuring contest, which is
shield measuring,
it's
right?
not
shield measuring.
Yeah, it's not unenjoyable to watch Thor and Iron Man and Cap all go at it together. But at the same time, yeah, I don't know. It's not as enjoyable as it used to be, and I think part of that is because the other thing about I think the TV logic here is that people don't actually have conversations. And and TV, many times, the conflicts that you have between people are because people don't actually just say what they should say to each other, and they keep it to themselves, and then it boils over, right? And that's kind of what happens, I think, here in many ways, is that people don't really begin to have conversations too far into the movie. And then by that point, now it's time for us all to work together and fight because we got to save New York. And that's what brings everybody together, is something bigger. But what's fascinating to me here, and I wanted to ask you about this as well, is going forward, what Loki is after in his kind of tyranny reminded me of how similar he and Stark are in the end. Because this will become the fight, basically, between Cap and Stark in Civil War, where Stark is about telling people what to do and that they have to follow these different rules and that basically they should just bow down because everybody should follow these rules. And Cap's like, no, that's not how this works. This is America, basically. And it was fascinating to me to see that this conversation is going to continue subtly throughout, and it's going to be really the Russo brothers who pick this up, this thematic elements, and then they do them better in Winter Soldier and then, of course, in Civil War. And really, in the end, Tony kind of becomes the stand-in almost for Loki by the time we get to Civil War. So I just thought that was really interesting.
I wouldn't go so far as to say he's a stand-in for Loki, and I think primarily because I don't want to get too far down the road. I'm just going to say I don't think he winds up becoming a stand-in for Loki.
Sure.
We'll double
we
back to that when we talk about those movies. But the one thing I'll say is that where Tony just winds up being misguided because his intentions are better than Loki.
Sure.
Tony isn't seeking power for himself.
Exactly.
He's just advocating for a bad thing. And I guess we've tipped our hands as to whose side we took in Civil War. So go figure.
That's shocking.
As all people should. But, it is singularly interesting to sort of pick this apart because I think we're probably coming across as more negative. And I know that we'll get back to, stuff that we did truly enjoy. But one thing I want to ask about is the effects. Do you think that these effects... Now, Avengers is not terribly old. Avengers 2012, right? 2012 is when this came out, right? So it's 9 years. Do you think 9 years later that these effects hold up? Do you think that these are good effects that would, if you release this movie today, would hold up? Well, I mean, that's a bad measuring. People are very forgiving of the big corporate effects things. But do you think that these effects are great effects that hold up? Or do you think that do you wind up giving it the ultimate damning with faint praise sort of compliment of they're very good for the time?
I don't think that it helps that they film on the Arri Alexa digital camera. This movie looks plasticky in many places, in the sense of it. And I know people love this movie for this reason, but it feels way too bright, and it's very cartoony in a sense of the way that the effects work. And part of that comes from and I would say in many ways Captain America may be the first movie that kind of made this feel a little bit more like this, where you kind of got super cartoony. But the other films in this series, well, I guess even Thor though too is guilty of this as well. But the first three films are very grounded, right, and very kind of I would say much more gritty and realistic feeling. And the last three films in this first phase continuously get more cartoonish in the way that they feel, in the sense of just everything feels less real as we go on to the point where I think we get to the final battle in New York, and the sets that they're on and the computer graphic extensions and everything never merge well. And part of that is their choice to overlight everything.
Now, see, that's the error, is it's TV lighting. Okay?
It absolutely is TV
TV
lighting.
lights have to be more bright. And the thing is, I'm not going to say it's because it's shot on the Arri Alexa, because there were movies that were shot on the Arri Alexa that don't look that way. Skyfall.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, Skyfall.
Well, but you also have Deakins as the DP on that movie, and Deakins is a genius.
True,
so,
but you have Drive, which is another great looking film.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely
Iron
right.
Man 3 gets
point.
filmed on it, all of that stuff. So I think that where the problem lies is in the director and the DP shooting too bright.
Yep.
But obviously shooting too bright with intent. But to your point, I definitely think that's why, for instance, when Black Widow is zooming along the skies of New York on that rocket sled thing, it really is
not good.
Looking at it saying, oh, yeah, okay. And
that's not real. I mean, you are immediately pulled out and going, oh, that's not real.
And the problem is, and the thing is, it's so easy to then come back at us and say, yeah, well, what do you expect? It's not real. But there are moments that look more real. What I find odd looking at it in terms of the visual tone is I don't know why they didn't have some sort of cloud effect or something to darken New York while the battle was going on, which would have added to a sense of foreboding and fear and real stakes, whereas this looks like a bunch of people on a movie lot running around blowing stuff up.
Yep.
And it's, again, I know how negative we're coming across, but you got to be fair.
I do think part of that is because we're also thinking about the reality of comic book movies as for where they came from to where they are now. And I think one of the genius elements that we saw in, I would say specifically just the Iron Man films and even in Hulk, was that the end battles take place at night with where you're going to have super heavy effects so that the lighting helps you out with the effects, right?
Oh, yeah.
Even in Hulk.
Absolutely.
And so I think absolutely the same thing here. And I hate to do this, but that's one of the things that I think Zack Snyder does really well, is that all of his movies are color-coded specifically so that everything matches. And so that color coding and lighting and everything that they've done is to make the movie consistent all the way through. Whereas, again, I feel like you're absolutely right in that Avengers feels like it's lit more for the television screen than it is for the movie screen. And everything is so over bright that it pulls you out. And look, a bright sunny day in New York, this is what I'm sure this would look like. But I don't necessarily think that's the best choice for creating the best visual milieu to have this final battle in.
Right. And it's odd as well because I think that the night scene where they're fighting Thor, there's this weird difficulty with how bright and how dark some things look. And I think that
100%.
In some of the Captain America shots in the Battle of New York, he looks like he's just a guy. And I'm going to phrase it in such a way that's going to probably tick off a ton of people. It looks like a guy just cosplaying. It doesn't look like
Part of
Yeah,
it's
and I
that
know-
terrible costume that they have him in, which is hideous, but
It's well, even the costume itself is too bright. The fabric is weird looking. It just, it's not awesome. And it's, but the thing is, at the same time, we're sitting here, we're hammering on these things. I, again, have to give the movie credit for bringing all of the characters together. I really think that Robert Downey Jr. gets a lot of opportunity to shine. Obviously, Whedon's whole methodology of quick wit, rapid fire is Robert Downey Jr. on holiday. He's just having a great time with the one-liners because he can deliver exactly what Whedon's looking for. I think that Whedon does. I mean, I think that Chris Evans can't give a bad performance, and I think that Ruffalo does good. You know, wow, that's terrible grammar. He does well.
Ruffalo do good.
Yeah, Ruffalo good movie making person act.
Hulk smash.
Yes, exactly. But that's the thing, right? Is I think you wind up forgiving a lot of the sins because you get moments like someone looking at Hulk and saying, Hulk, smash. And you're like, tee-hee, that's what they say in the comics. And so you get those little endorphin bursts that as a longtime comic book fan, you giggle to yourself and you say, yay, that's like they do in the thing I like. And it's, well, I mean, that just reminded me of how Red Letter Media approached Rogue One. So, which is one of the greatest reviews of all time. But
not as good as their Last Jedi review, but
not as good as their Halloween Kills review or Prometheus review. Trust me on that one. Anyway, it is. I think it's a movie that is overstays its welcome a little bit. I think that it's a movie that could have been shot in a more interesting fashion that reflected more mood than speed. I think that there are moments that could have been collapsed and streamlined for the sake of storytelling, as much as I also enjoy Colby Smulders.
As Maria Hill.
Thank you for looking that one up.
There you go.
But Black Widow could have been there.
Well,
they could have taken that character out.
Yeah, I do want to ask you about that. And I feel like Maria Hill is there because they want to have another strong female voice in the film. So it's not just Black Widow.
Yeah.
But I did notice, and I wanted to ask you, so we kind of need to deal with the elephant in the room of Joss Whedon and who we all know him to be now, and his treatment, I think, of Natasha in this film. Do you see that? In light of that, do you see anywhere where you feel like Whedon was taking the character in a direction that she didn't deserve to be taking in? Or do you think he did a good job of actually taking the character and making her more important in this group of boys?
I think that ultimately he does a good job with Natasha. I think that in her introduction scene, it's maybe a little indulgent in one direction that it didn't need to be. With the way the camera is positioned and the clothing that she's wearing. I understand the setup is supposed to be that she was basically acting like a honeypot for the Russian general and everything. I get it. But they still could have shot that a little bit differently when she's in the damsel in distress mode.
Sure.
I think that overall he does the character justice. I do think that she gets good moments when she goes to get Banner. That's a good that's a good scene.
I agree with you.
When she interacts with Hawkeye, that's a good scene. And you really believe that there's history between these two characters. So I think that on the balance sheet, he does well. And from what I understand, one of the bigger criticisms of Whedon overall, aside from the other stuff that we're just alluding to here, is that he had favorites, that he played favorites, and he would favor one actor or actress over another. I have the sense here that he didn't play that game so much. I don't think that it shows here. I think that Avengers, he's probably on his best behavior, and then the success of the Avengers leads to Age of Ultron, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, that's a whole other discussion we'll have to have.
Oh, not looking forward to that one. Not looking forward to that one.
I agree with you for the most part on your take about what they do and what he does specifically with Natasha. I think he does make her very integral to the plot here in a really interesting way, especially with her being the one to kind of trick Loki into giving up what his plan is. I think, that's ingenious, kind of shows her ingenuity. What's made her a good spy for all of these years is being able to play people in a variety of different ways, especially obviously with what we saw at the beginning where she is playing these guys. They think they have her right where they want her, and actually she's got them right where she wants them, giving up everything. And so, I think all of that's really well done and enjoyable, and, watching her kick those guys' butts is great. So I do think that you are probably right that he is on his best behavior in this film. I think if there's any favorite he has, it's probably Robert Downey Jr., and it shows he enjoys writing for Robert, mainly because Robert can deliver the dialogue to which he is so known for writing so well.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know if anybody else in this cast is as quick-witted, obviously, as Robert Downey Jr., and maybe ScarJo, she's pretty decent at delivering those super quippy liners. And then, Jerry Renner is actually decent at it as well, especially when he gets his head knocked and he's finally back to normal. So, it's just fascinating. Obviously, I think the big issues with him and his personality don't actually come, like you said, until we get to Age of Ultron. And I think here, many of his strengths are what make this movie, I think, good, which, to talk about what we like, I think one of the things that he does really well is found families. Obviously, that's the biggest thing about Firefly, and that's what this movie becomes about. And if this movie is kind of about anything, it's about these super characters who are very flawed finding a found family that will allow them to hopefully become their best selves. That's what any superhero team-up usually tends to be about in the comics. And I think that Joss, that's exactly what he's kind of going for here in Avengers. And I think he does that pretty well for the most part, of trying to mix and match all these characters together and have some fun with them. Do some things that fans will really enjoy. Like I think of that Hulk-Thor fight.
Yeah.
Which is enjoyable to watch those two characters go at it. Like you mentioned, telling Hulk to go smash, in many ways, Tony believing in Hulk in the first place and believing that the Hulk himself could be a hero even when, Banner doesn't see it. So I think there's some really strong positives here that we're able to bring in with these characters and bringing them all together, which, makes it an exciting conclusion in many ways to Phase 1.
Yeah, I agree with you about the found family. I agree with you about there are arcs that work really well. I think that Whedon is naturally adept at making characters distinct. There's no question who is who. There's no bleed over between Cap and Tony. Everybody is who they are. And I never have a question as to what type of character they are. I think that he gives Coulson some moments to shine. I think that I try not to think about the fact that they brought Coulson back for the TV show, because Coulson's death actually was very affecting. And I think that Sam Jackson, this is a good moment for him. This is a good moment for him. And I think that he shines here too. I think that while we've beaten up on the effects, there are some effects that still hold up incredibly well, to the point where it's like, wow, this, if you released this today, people would say that's an amazing effect. I would totally go on with that. I enjoy the fact that they have a moment to demonstrate exactly how strong Cap's shield is, so that they can reestablish, really, if I missed Captain America, that this thing's virtually indestructible. And I can say, oh, wow, that's great. And if I do stay with the movie and the rest of the movies going forward, I always have that in the back of my brain. The Cap's shield stood up to Mjolnir. And so, wow, that's pretty impressive. And so I gotta ask, though, do you think, because we talked about this with Captain America, the First Avenger, do you think that overture of Silvestri's from Captain America does turn into the symphony we've been looking for this whole time in terms of score?
I do think that Silvestri's score here for the Avengers is good. You know, obviously it's a very memorable theme. It's very hummable. It can kind of get stuck in your brain. It's a nice earworm. It's exactly what you want. It's on the level in the sense of, like, you can remember it, like with a Superman theme or the Batman theme from '89. You know, that's excellent. That's what you want from a superhero movie, you know, and I think it's crazy that it's really the last two movies that give us themes to which have any recognition, and one is Captain America and the other is the Avengers. The one thing I will say, though, that, and many, many, many composers these days run into this problem, which is that I miss the robustness and fullness of the symphonic scores that someone like Williams or a Horner or Jerry Goldsmith were able to create with their orchestration, which there was this very full sound. And I do miss that many of the more modern composers tend to have decent sounding orchestration, but it doesn't have that richness to it, if that makes sense.
It totally does.
And whereas I think this is the best score now so far, Silvestri nails what you want from the Avengers by giving them a great theme. I do wish that you would turn up the richness factor so that it just feel like you want this to be a celebration finally. And the theme is a celebration that the Avengers have come together. But it still feels a little, and this is going to sound terrible, but I don't mean this in a horrible sense, but it just has a more hollow feel to it than something that you would have gotten previously in another generation.
I agree that there's nothing that rumbles in your bones in this score. There's nothing that makes my hair stand up on end. And that's the one element I would have liked. It's got a great theme, but when I listen to Williams's Superman or Elfman's Batman, right, I can feel this primal emotional build in my belly just come up, and I get that adrenaline dump. And even with Junkie XL's work on Zack Snyder's Justice League, if I listen to I mean, Man of Steel's that's a ridiculous score, and just that one track, Flight, like just thinking about it, like I get goosebumps. Or from Justice League, Superman Rising Part 2, is like, oh, like I could just do anything listening to that. So I do think that this is a good score with a very memorable, great theme, but overall it's just lacking that little bit of punch that I would have been looking for. One last thing I want to hit on is in terms of the stingers. I think that this is where we transition into the stinger as cheat, so that they can work in a plot point that they didn't have time to work in the movie proper. And so it's a cheat They couldn't figure out how to do it, so it exists here. The end of Captain America: The First Avenger is pretty much just a scene from the Avengers. It's just a teaser for the Avengers. And the teasers before that are very much inconsequential in a large way in terms of how you're looking at the story as a whole. It doesn't really matter that Tony shows up with Thunderbolt Ross to talk about the Avengers initiative. Or it's a nice treat, but it's not integral, but given the fact that Ross never shows up again for several films. But one thing that will always stand out to me is when the alien goes on his knee and talks about attacking the Earth and the Avengers is to court death. And we get our first real reveal of Thanos turning his head to the side and smiling. I was so hopeful that they were going to build toward, yes, Infinity Gauntlet, but with him actually courting death the way he does in the comic books. Because for anybody not familiar, in that original Infinity Gauntlet saga from years and years ago, Thanos is a nihilist, however you want to pronounce it. He just wants to end it all because he's literally in love with death. The personification of death holds his heart.
Make
he's
good life choices.
Right? But he's in love with her, and he starts destroying the universe because he wants her to love him.
Right.
It's this really, like, Marvel Comics back in the 70s and 80s were just bonkers with the type of stuff that they did. And I was so hopeful they were going to go that way. And so I got sort of what they promised, but not quite the way I was expecting it. And this stinger with Thanos is always a little bit too much of a tease for me because it's meant to evoke that old comic series and throw us, I guess. But at least we're on the scent now that Thanos is going to be our big villain over the course of everything.
I had no problem with it. Then, I think as we went on in the Marvel Universe, I was like, this is taking forever. It takes forever to get to Infinity War and then Endgame. It's like, it's such a tease that this is where we're going, and then 10 years later, we'll get there. It's kind of obnoxious.
But it'll be interesting to see if it's not as obnoxious when we watch it in quicker fashion.
It could be, yeah.
Which would again speak to the whole idea of this as big budget television. Yeah. Because TV is less annoying with the longer plots because when you can binge watch something, which is essentially what we're doing here, when you can binge watch, your patience is tested less.
I've got to ask you a question because obviously Ruffalo replaces Ed Norton.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what Feige said about their decision. Our decision is definitely not one based on monetary factors, but instead rooting in the need for an actor who embodies the creativity and collaborative spirit of our other talented cast members. The Avengers demands players who thrive working as a part of an ensemble, as evidenced by Robert, Chris H., Chris E., Samuel, Scarlett, and all of our talented casts. We are looking to announce a name of an actor who fulfills these requirements and is passionate about the iconic role in the coming weeks.
Mm-hmm. He could have made a much quicker statement and prepare the bleep button by simply releasing a statement saying Ed Norton's a dick, and then just sent that out. That's essentially what he just said. And pardon the bleep, but seriously, there was no need to do that. They purposely tore Norton down in that one. And if you notice, Norton's career starts to have some difficulty from this point forward. Mm-hmm. This is where he gets a reputation as a very difficult actor to work with.
Right.
And I guess this is our first object lesson in Disney and Marvel will not be afraid to make an example out of you if you step out of line. They did it with Terrence Howard, and now they're doing it with Ed Norton. And
I mean, it's the old studio system reborn.
But at the same time, I will say this, that there was a point in my life where I was working at a place where somebody was let go for various reasons. None of them legal, though. But a lot of stuff rooted in personality issues. Person was not easy to work with at all. Made everybody's life very, very difficult. And then that person later applied at a different position within the same umbrella. And the people that were familiar with this person said, no, don't hire this person. You will make your life more difficult than it needs to be. So I will simply say that while I just, had the joke at the expense of, how Feige could have said that faster, I do understand if somebody's going to be a poison pill, you don't necessarily want them around on the set. What I don't like is, drawing from that same example that I just gave, it's not that they went out and then torched that person elsewhere. They were like, have a good life. You're not working here. And so I think Feige could have made a much different statement to say, looking at the way things aligned, Ruffalo was who we wanted to go with originally, so that's why we made the choice that we did. No hard feelings. We wish him the best of luck. That statement was unnecessarily harsh to Ed Norton and very much paints him in a negative light.
And what's interesting to me about the whole thing is the fact that, from everything I've read, the fact that the Hulk is as successful as we both thought it was is probably down to Ed Norton being very passionate about the project and not accepting less than what he felt the character itself deserved.
But I do remember reports that he, on the press tour, might have, in their opinion, taken a little bit too much credit for his contributions. He wasn't magnanimous about it. He was like, it's great because I did it. Will that
just be a problem with Marvel in general, not wanting anybody to have more press than Marvel?
Yeah, probably so. Probably so.
I'm just saying, I feel like that is actually kind of part of the issue here, is that there's a lot of ego involved, and I think a lot of ego becomes about, this is about the system and not about any one person. Even though, Marvel would not have been successful if it hadn't been for Robert Downey Jr. I mean, in all honesty, that's what this is built on, is his charisma and the fact that he worked in Iron Man in the first place.
But I sincerely have a feeling that Robert Downey Jr., when he renegotiated his contract, it was he probably gets money from every single Marvel movie that's made until his character is done.
Probably.
So it's like, is he going to create problems? No, he's making $1 bajillion a year. Mm-hmm. What does he care?
And one of the questions that we've kind of asked through this, and I think before we get to the ratings, I think this is a good way to kind of close it out, is that how does this impact the franchise? And I think that this fully cements the formula. This fully cements the Iron Man. We're going to go with the quippy one-liners. That's how we're going to do business. That and the bright, shiny, neon feel for our heroes and the look of most of the films. There will be a couple of exceptions to that, but on a whole, that's the formula.
I would say that even though it takes a few more movies to get there, it is, in a large sense, this is Goldfinger for the Marvel Universe. Mm-hmm. Where Dr. No, you have aspects of it. You have a good, strong lead who's charismatic. From Russia with Love, you actually have From Russia with Love, I think, is one of the best Bond movies in existence. But it's darker, it's a little grittier, it's a little bit more tactile than Bond's reputation comes to be. And then you get to Goldfinger, and whatever cultural issues you're going to have with it, set that aside. Template-wise, it sets the template. And it's so successful that they say, that's it. That's James Bond. And that's what the movies are going to be like from that point forward. So I think this is the Goldfinger moment for the MCU.
Well, with that in mind, John, what do you rate the Avengers?
Wow. This is tough because I've gone back and forth and I'm having trouble. I really am having trouble because again, I don't think that the thematic depth is there the same way it was even in Captain America or even in the Hulk. I think that overall there are things that don't work. I think that it overstays its welcome and the final battle is too darn long. I think that, like I said, the first stinger winds up being a story cheat. Not a big fan of that. I will, however, wind up giving it 3.5 because it's still well put together. The characters still work. And where I was having trouble was I was bouncing back and forth between 3 and 3.5. But technically, it's a well put together script. Everybody gets good face time. It's clear who each character is. The theme is good. The musical theme is good. Overall, the effects work. So, yeah, I landed 3.5. What about you?
This is really, as we've been talking about the film and as I've been thinking about it, I've really been struggling. Is this a 3 or is this a 3.5?
Yep.
It is absolutely like the hardest one so far for me to come to because is 3 too harsh? And is 3.5 too generous? That's really what I'm coming down to. And
same, yeah.
And gosh, man, I'm really as with how I struggled with Thor, I'm struggling with the Avengers because it doesn't hold up as well as it wants to. And I think maybe even people's imaginations think it does. But I still think that for what it does for comic books in general, of being the first one to really bring a whole team together, I am going to slide and let it have a 3.5. Even though, in all honesty, it's probably more a 3. Which makes it just better than an average film, which it is. But I think its place in history for bringing these characters together and bringing a whole team together is what will put it there at 3.5. So, I don't know. Maybe catch me on a bad day and it's a 3. Who knows? But I guess with that said, John, it's now time to rank the films. And so I'm really interested.
This is the part that tests my memory. Oh God!
Yeah. Well,
help me.
But it's okay because with Avengers thrown into the mix, it could throw some things out of whack for you in your list. So I don't think it's a bad thing.
Yeah. Okay, so let me try to remember here. Iron Man's going to remain at the top. Captain America: The First Avenger. Although I've been waffling since we last talked about it, it's going to remain in the number 2 slot. I'm going to let it slide. I'm going to let it stay there. The Incredible Hulk stays at number 3. The Avengers comes in at number 4. Thor at number 5. And Iron Man 2 stays locked in the basement, never to emerge until much later in this conversation.
I love it. Well, it's funny. So I'm Iron Man, obviously, number 1. Captain America, the First Avenger, number 2.
All right.
Incredible Hulk, number 3.
We're going neck and neck right here.
Number 4 is the Avengers.
Yep.
Number 5 is Iron Man 2. And number 6 is Thor. And Thor will... possibly stay there for quite a long time until we get to some other films in the series. So
I just love the fact that even though they're different for us, we've both chosen a child of scorn in the MCU
Yes.
already, and we can't resist it. We have to keep mentioning how much we dislike it.
Yes, very true.
So I just find it so fun and interesting that we're basically like flip sides of the same coin there, but we cannot resist the urge to say, and you stay in the corner over there. I don't want to see you at the table. Get away.
Yeah, and who knows how long it'll be before, that can come out of the corner and something else is thrown into the corner. But we'll get there.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
We will.
So, oh, man.
I have a feeling that the word Thor is in the title, though.
Maybe. Who knows? It could be sooner than that. But, John, this show has just been so much fun as we've been going back and revisiting these films together. And so if people do want to catch up with you and talk to you and, talk about their thoughts on the Avengers or anything else, where can people find you?
Well, if you're crazy enough to come looking for me, you can find me as Kessel Junkie on your social network of choice, KESSELJUNKIE. I am out there everywhere to be found, and am even toying with the idea of starting to blog again because, why not? But for now, probably come on over and check me out over on Letterboxd, which is the movie rating social network. Can't get too controversial there, and it's a lot of fun because I watch a lot of movies. You can also find me over on the Nerd Party Network, co-hosting 2 shows. One show is called House Lights, where we go through the works of directors, either by decade, by entire body of work, or whatever crazy combination we come up with. And I co-host that with Darren Moser and Tristan Riddell. And I'm also on a show on the Nerd Party called Aggressive Negotiations, a Star Wars podcast that I co-host with the charming Mr. Matthew Rushing right over there. And where else can people find you, Matt?
Well, you could find me all over the place on social media at MattRushing02. You can also find me here on the network with the main show, the 602 Club, which is the same feed you are here. Make sure you check all that out. I hope you will. Of course, you can find Snyder Cuts there as well with John. And then, of course, here on the network, doing Warp 5, The Orb, and Literary Treks. Warp 5 is about Star Trek Enterprise. Literary Treks is about the books and the comics of Star Trek, and The Orb is about Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And then over on the Nerd Party Network, not only doing Aggressive Negotiations with John, also did Owl Post with Drea Kaufman, which is a Harry Potter podcast. We went through every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time, and that is a finished show, so you can enjoy the whole thing now. But thank you so much for joining us.
Avengers!